Thank you so much for joining us and spending your lunch hour with us as we have a discussion around making innovation your competitive advantage. My name is Mark Seifert. I am a solutions advisor with our Center for Professional and Executive Development at the Wisconsin School of Business. And for those that aren't familiar, CPED, as our acronym says, offers online and in-person programs and certificates that will give you the relevant skills needed to advance in your career. All of our programs offer interactive live learning sessions facilitated by instructors with practical business experience. We also partner with organizations to provide customized professional development programs and coaching and consulting. So, if your organization is going through a transition or transformation, we come in and help with that as well. So, Adam, if you go to that next slide, for more information on the Center for Professional Executive Development, please do visit our website at uwcped.org. Thanks so much. So before I introduce our speaker, Adam, today, I did want to let you know we have a Q&A session at the end today. So if you'll see on your box here, there's a viewing box with a questions kind of tab. You can submit questions using that questions box from the sidebar here, and you can expand or collapse the sidebar using the orange arrow. So please, as the presentation is going on, feel free to submit your questions, and we will get to as many as we can at the end today. So now I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Adam J. Bock. Adam is an award-winning academic, serial entrepreneur, and experienced strategy consultant that has co-authored 3 books on business models and entrepreneurship and published more than 20 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters. He's also an instructor for multiple programs here at CPED, as well as many custom relationships with our client partners. So thank you so much for joining us today, Adam, and we look forward to it, and I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mark. Thanks to everyone for spending a few minutes with us here. We're going to take a little time to talk about innovation, and as Mark said, we're going to save a little time at the end for Q&A. You can type questions in during the process, or you can wait until the end. Here's what we want to talk about for our webinar. We want to talk a little bit about innovation as the new challenge. We'll talk about the problem with creativity inside organizations, and we'll briefly touch on the idea of building an innovation system. We're going to keep the webinar pretty tight and short here. We know everybody has lots of things to do, so this is obviously going to be an overview and a quick summary with a couple things for you to participate in. Try to do a little Q&A at the end as well. So let's start with a poll right off the bat. And I know you didn't expect to be quizzed, but I also teach at the School of Business, so this is kind of the way it works. Just want to get your perspective. What's your guess? What % of executives say that innovation is important to my company's future success? Do you think that's 24%, 64%, 44%, or 84%? And Brooke, if you can please put that up. We'd really just like you to quickly participate in this poll. It's anonymous. We don't know who you are. We appreciate that you're guessing. But so please do just take a shot at this and let us know what you think. And Brooke, I'm going to just check in with you because I don't see everything that everybody else is seeing, so I can't tell whether people are responding or not, but I'm hoping you can tell.
And I apologize. I think since I tried to share it before, I am unable to reopen it.
Oh. No
so
problem.
For this one, I think we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. So yeah, I see a couple of people are throwing their answers into the questions box. That's a great alternative since we're apparently having some technical difficulties.
Thanks to everybody. Yep, folks are being innovative, which we always appreciate. There's usually an alternate solution. And this is then a technical glitch for us because Brooke and I actually tested this in advance, which now we're being punished for. So it just goes to show you that sometimes innovation fails. So
like
the odds are good. Yeah, the odds are good that you have some perspective on this. Let me just share with you what executives actually say, and then we'll see later on if the second poll works. What executives actually say is about 84% of them say that innovation is important to my company's future success. But you might be interested to know that another 84%, the 84% again, say it's important not just to their company's success, but to their growth strategy. And in fact, about 80% of executives now say that it's a top 3 initiative. So this is something that people have begun to realize is critical Not just, for example, tech companies or retail distribution. 50, 40 years ago, innovation was really very focused in a certain number of industries. And that's changed dramatically, especially in the last 10 to 20 years, and now in particular in the last couple of years as a result of the pandemic, where managers and executives have realized that our approach to innovation is going to drive the success and advantage of the organization over the long haul. So this is something that people have realized is much more important than we ever thought it was before, and important to more companies. I'm sorry, I'm hearing someone speaking, and I apologize that we're having a little technical problem here, but Brooke, can you still hear me?
Okay, I think you're good.
Okay, you think I'm good, okay. These are the kinds of things that you identified, and I have good news and bad news out of this. The good news is that this is normal. We've been working with dozens of organizations, and I have interaction outside of CPED with many other companies. And these are all the same kinds of things that other companies describe as being the challenges to innovation as well. The bad news is these are hard to fix. And there's no single magic bullet solution to address all of these kinds of problems that organizations face as they're trying to improve innovation for the long haul. So as you look through this list, the odds are that you're seeing something that maybe you submitted, or you're looking at it and realizing, oh my gosh, we deal with that kind of problem as well. So keep in mind, everyone is dealing with these kinds of challenges. These are not unique to your organization, and there are some ways to deal with them, but they are relatively challenging. The first problem that most organizations need to face is the fact that innovative thinking simply does not come naturally to most people. And this is a wonderful article. If you have time, I've mentioned it. I'll mention it at the end again. By Edward Hess, why is innovation so hard? And it's relevant at any kind of organization. It's just a reality that being creative and being innovative just doesn't come naturally to most people. And in fact, and so given that, you might ask yourself, what % of organizational innovations actually succeed? And so Brooke, if you could bring up the second poll, we'd love to see if we can, and there we go. So yep, so you correctly identified the tech problem earlier, Brooke. Thank you so much. Please do quickly participate in this. Given what we know about all the barriers that you face and the fact that people are not inherently innovative, what % of organizational innovations do you think actually succeed? Is it 10%, 30%, 50%, or 70%? Just take a moment, totally anonymous.
Responses. Yep, we are getting responses in. We are just about all the way there.
Awesome.
Give everybody just another quick minute. And then here are our results.
Awesome. So about almost half of you, equally split, said it's about 10% or 30%. And then there are a few of you who are much more optimistic, who are willing to think it's as high as 50%, or maybe even 70% of organizational innovation succeeding. Here's the upshot. It's actually very hard to know the answer to this question. Ironically, for some reason, companies don't like to talk about how many of their innovations succeed or fail. And so the data on this is not great, but the data that we do have strongly suggests that this number is less than 50%, and it might be as low as 5%, depending on the type of innovation and the industry that we're talking about. And I've given a couple of citations, just suggestions for areas that you can look at if you want to learn more about, go into this in more detail, and we can also provide these citations to you later on in the chat box or something at the very end if you'd like to follow up on this. But this is the hard reality, that the majority of innovations inside organizations simply don't succeed. And there's a reason for this. Innovation just isn't like the other functions at an organization. It's different than other business processes. And this makes sense in a lot of ways because most organizations grow and succeed by doing a specific set of things. They specialize, they become efficient, they create processes and activities that can be replicated, because once you've done that, right, once you've got specialization, efficiency, and replicability, it means that you can scale predictably. And scaling predictably is what makes firms grow successfully, right? That's what we need. We want to take what we do, we want to do more of it and generate more revenues and generate growth. But that's not how innovation actually works, right? Innovation doesn't work through specialization. Innovation is inherently inefficient. It's not consistently replicable. And because of that, it's not predictably scalable in the way that other functions are. But unfortunately, most organizations still treat innovation that way. They try to treat innovation the same way that they treat all the other functions of the organization. And because of that, we discover that they miss crucial growth opportunities and they don't learn effectively from past mistakes. And you can probably sort of see how this plays out by just thinking about it like this. If you imagine, are the people in your marketing organization trained in marketing? Are the people in your finance part of your organization trained in finance? Do the HR people have HR training? And the answer is probably yes. Now think about how many people at your organization actually have received formal training on creativity, innovation, experimentation, adaptation, or failure. And the odds are good that very few, if any, of the people inside your organization have ever been trained in that kind of way. And so you can see how organizations are almost set up to do innovation poorly. So a lot of this comes back then to this question about being creative, right? Because at some level within an innovation process, people have to be able to come up with ideas that are different or new, a different approach, a different perspective. And so what I'd like you to do for a moment here, just in your mind, think about the circumstances, like the time, the place, the context, the activity, when you are the most creative. Maybe it's a time of day, maybe it's a certain activity you do, maybe it's a certain situation after some process during the day. When is it that you are the most creative? Okay, so I want you to imagine that just for the moment. What is that? What is that time, process, circumstance in which you are the most creative person that you can be? All right, do you have that in your mind? Awesome. Here's my question for you. Whoops. I've just come to you and said, hey, team, we've got this running problem in the organization, and it's time to get together and be innovative to solve it. So we're going to meet Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m., and we're going to brainstorm solutions to this running problem. We're going to have to come up with 5 of them. Okay? So let me ask you, will you be at your most creative in that meeting? Given what you said, what you were thinking about in terms of when you were the most creative, will you be at your most creative in that meeting that I have called? So take a moment and just answer this last poll. How are we doing, Brooke?
We're getting there. Got a couple more people that are thinking.
Okay.
So I'll give them just another second, and then we have our results.
And there we go, right? So roughly, 88% of you have thought about this and realized, you know what? I am just not going to be at my most creative on Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m. under these very specific circumstances, right? Maybe you said you're most creative in the morning, or maybe you've said you're most creative when you're out for a jog, or maybe you're the most creative when you're not under stress, or you're at the most creative when you're not distracted or can think about other things. Maybe you're most creative when you're surrounded by friends. But the reality is that the vast majority of us are not going to be at our most creative at precisely the times that the organization is asking us to be creative and innovative. And again, this is exactly why innovation is so different than all the other functions of the organization, right? If you go to the marketing team and say, we expect you to use good marketing capabilities on Thursday from 2 to 4 p.m., that's a reasonable thing to do, or to ask someone to balance the books, or to ask someone to manage the human resource process, whatever it happens to be. Because of the nature of innovation requirements and characteristics, it's much more difficult to guarantee that in this context, we are going to get people's best output. So the challenge here is you can't predict innovation. You can't predict who's going to be innovative, when they're going to be innovative, or under and in what circumstances. And here's a wonderful little example of this. This was a company that I actually studied for some of my research a number of years ago called Metallicis. It's a UK-based company at the time. It was a startup tech company spun out of a university. And they had this patented process for refining very high-value ores like titanium and tantalum much more efficiently and with much less pollution. So it's this whole company filled with scientists in this very technical space, metallurgical sciences. And because it was an innovative company and it was a startup, they decided they would do this little innovation competition. This was like the 3rd year the company had existed. And they offered up a £100 prize, like $120. Everybody could submit one idea. And when they got all the ideas and they evaluated them, the management team suddenly realized, oh my goodness, the absolute best innovation we got didn't come from a PhD or a master's level technician. It came from one of their janitors. She was an immigrant, she had no college education, and her job was to clean up. So they would run these experimental batches in their manufacturing, in their R&D facility, and then it was her job to clean up all of the stuff that was left over. And what she pointed out was they started these runs on Monday, and they didn't finish them until Wednesday. And then it took 12 hours to do the cleaning. And by the time the cleaning was done, it was too late to run another batch before the weekend. And she said, if you just get me this high-powered system, I can do the cleaning process in 4 hours and you can start a second batch. So she doubled their R&D capacity with this one very simple thing, which nobody else had thought of because no one else was responsible for actually cleaning up. And that's one of the real challenges with innovation, is that we have to think about it in a more holistic way. We have to be prepared to get the information and the ideas from the people who are actually there and know what's going on. There are some foundations of organizational innovation that can help organizations become better about this. One is to have a portfolio versus a eureka approach. So instead of simply assuming that there's one really creative person at the organization and we're going to count on that person to generate new innovations at a given time in a given place, we have a more holistic perspective in which everyone is contributing to an innovation system. You do need active leadership champions. You do need people at the senior executive level who are prepared to say, this is important, and I'm going to be involved in this. And when I see interesting innovations, I will help champion them. Where possible, we like to see flexible resource management. If I have an interesting idea and I go to Brooke, who's my boss, and I say, Brooke, I need 6 hours in the next couple of weeks to try this idea out. Brooke needs the flexibility to say, well, Adam, that's a lot of time, but I will get, Mark and Trinity to work to cover you for a couple of hours each of the next couple of weeks. And then I need you to report back what data you generated so we can make a decision about whether to make an additional investment in this. We want to see a culture of shared success and failure. Many organizations are quite good about sharing big successes, right? So this is something we accomplished last year. It was amazing and we generated more revenue. But they're often not as good about sharing the smaller successes, and they're often terrible at sharing failures. Oh, we thought this about customers, we tried something, it didn't work. Look how much we learned from that. Sharing those failures is usually quite scary, in particular because people think it will be held against them in performance reviews and things like that. We want to see stakeholder-driven innovation. Rather than simply, oh, we think this is a good idea, we want to be able to recognize that innovation needs to be driven by stakeholders, whether those are external stakeholders like customers or internal stakeholders like another department or another group, where there's something that needs to be accomplished and we now have a way that we want to test out that might help that. And then finally, we need to recognize that innovation isn't simply a thing, it isn't just saying let's be innovative. There has to be a system, there has to be structure, and there have to be incentives at the organization built around this. And this was in some of the work that we have done, we've been able to look at how organizations are doing innovation and find ways for them to say, here are areas beyond R&D that you might want to focus on, because innovation at organizations should be more than just product development. So this was the result of a sort of an innovation audit that we did for a CPG firm, in which we were able to determine that they had a series of innovation projects that they had done, but there were a whole other set of areas across the organization where they were probably good at innovation, but they hadn't actually taken on a lot of projects in those areas. And that's because they were outside of where this company had traditionally tried to focus. They were in supply chain management, customer presence, and customer experience. And doing this was a way of helping them think a little more broadly about what innovation could mean. The challenge is that this is hard. And this was an interaction I had with a senior executive of a fairly large organization. The person said to me, you know, look, innovation's in, it's in our DNA, it's in our core values, it's in our mission statement, it's in our strategy. We tell people to be creative, we tell them we want them to take risks. And so I said, hey, that's great, but is it in your performance system? Is it in your compensation plan? Do you create mechanisms in those areas for people to fail? We know the failure rate for innovation is more than 50%. So if you tell people to innovate, you are telling them to fail. So the question is, are you going to reward them or punish them for that? And when I asked, have you built this into your systems? The response was no. And I said, well, if you haven't built those into your systems, why are you expecting people to actually do it? And that's the hardest part about all of this, is recognizing that you can't just talk about it. You actually have to implement processes and systems inside the organization in order to create the actual incentives. Otherwise, you're going to tell people to take risks. Some of those will fail, and then the organization may not reward them for that. They won't do it anymore, right? People will do what you reward them to do. So if these are some of the things that you've noticed at your organizations, here are some of the questions you might want to ask. Are we innovating to create stakeholder value? Or are we just kind of innovating for the sake of doing new things because we've been told to be innovative? Do we have an actual innovation system? Or are we simply telling individuals we want them, just be creative now. We just need this, you know, today, this month, whatever it happens to be. Does innovation match up with and support your overall competitive strategy? This is something I've been working with a number of companies on, especially in the wake of the pandemic, which is making sure that their innovation efforts are actually aligned with the competitive strategy that they're implementing. And then finally, are we actually managing innovation, or are we just kind of hoping it happens? And that's the real challenge, because so many of these organizations just kind of hope that innovation will happen. So thank you for taking the time to share with me some of your thoughts and for listening to some ideas around innovation. Here are those couple of sources of information that you might find useful. The Innovator's Dilemma, maybe the greatest book about innovation that's been written in the past 40 years. Absolutely fascinating stuff. It is an older book, and it is about the disk drive industry, which is an older industry. But the insights into the Innovator's Dilemma are absolutely essential and still 100% relevant for today. So that's all I wanted to cover. Would love to maybe try to address a couple of questions if folks have some things that they'd like to talk about. So I will see if I can get my interface here with the GoToWebinar to work, but also just see if Mark or Brooke can help me if there are questions that have already been entered in.
Well, yeah, thanks, Adam. So yeah, please do just, if you do have questions, feel free to put them in that question box and we will get to them. One that came up actually from the first poll was around, you were saying what percentage of innovations actually succeed, and the question from Alan was, how do you define succeed? Is
Yeah,
that, yeah.
yeah. It's a good question in and of itself, right? It's a wonderful thing for academics to argue about. In the context of that survey work that was done, their definition of success was that the innovation generated value through successful implementation. And when we talk about innovation success in organizations, on the one hand, we do want to recognize that there is success in failure, right? So we have this hypothesis about what we think our customers want or our internal stakeholders want. And so we run some type of experiment on it, and the experiment fails, and we learn from that. But that's not sort of the way that that particular survey question was asked. That was really targeted more towards, did the innovation actually have legs? Did it actually create some value? Were you able to implement it? And there, for certain, we know that those numbers are much lower than 50%. So great question, Alan.
Well, and then so that they're flying in now. So do you have examples of what? So this is from Tom, and thank you, Tom, of what sharing failure looks like. Specific examples.
Yeah, so sharing failure can take a lot of different forms. It can be as simple as teams who have like a weekly or monthly huddle where there's a readout of, here's something we tried that didn't work. And I've been working with a couple of different companies who have actually made that an explicit part of their team meetings, their huddles, their different events like that, where there's an expectation that on a regular basis, people will step up and say, oh, we tried this and it didn't work. Or we tried this, it didn't work quite the way we expected. There are ways to go after this from a much more documented perspective. One of my favorite examples is actually from Procter & Gamble. Their UK business had they discovered that they had hundreds of people who were unintentionally replicating work being done by other people in the organization that hadn't worked out. And they had done some work on this in the 1990s and discovered that it was costing the company tens of millions of dollars. And so they built this data set internally by the early 2000s, I think is when it was fully implemented. And the expectation was that as their scientists and their technology people were working on new ideas, they would enter the information about them and the results of the work, including if it failed. And in fact, they were being measured by the number of projects, regardless of whether the success or failure, whether it was a success or failure. But they were being monitored for and rewarded for the number of specific projects that were documented. And when they did that and discovered that a significant number of these just didn't work out, people began responding immediately like, oh, I already tried that, or I was about to try that. And now I realize that that there's no reason to do that because it's not going to work. So this business of reporting and sharing failure can be very informal, but it can also be totally formalized into a knowledge set. And I think a lot of that just depends on the type of company, the industry, how quickly things are moving, and in particular, the way the organization is structured and the culture. That's the other challenge, is you have to take into account the culture of the organization and what people are prepared to live with.
So this is kind of a subset of that question. I think you kind of answered it, but I'm gonna throw it out there anyways. So speaking of the failure piece, how do you include, you talked about the metrics that need to be tied in measures. How do you include innovation in a compensation plan where failure is part of of innovation? And I'm guessing that that's part of the cultural piece too, right? Around. Yeah.
It is, right? So at the beginning, so part of it, what I would say is that there's a cultural maturity issue at stake here, right? So some organizations are culturally immature. That is, they have operated in a certain way for so long where nobody talks about failure, and any kind of failure is going to get you, sort of going to have negative consequences in a performance review process. That putting together incentives for failure is going to be more challenging, and it's going to need to be much lighter touch, right? And the messaging around it will also have to be much more careful. as you get organizations that are more culturally mature and are more capable of living with failure and talking about failure and recognizing the learning from failure, you can become much more aggressive about it. But the mechanisms for it all have to do with the way that you set the metrics up, right? So you can't do things like, oh, you'll get a reward every time you fail at something, right? Because that, first of all, we're not trying to reward incompetence. We're trying to reward failure that generates learning, right? And so an example of this kind of thing that that we can talk about is when teams are looking at interaction with customers. Inevitably, there are hypotheses about what those customers think and do at the point of sale, at the point of purchase, right? So one way of creating these kinds of incentives is to focus not on the innovation itself as a starting point, but on the hypotheses and the learning that you're getting, right? So we believe that customers do this, or we believe customers believe this. And we went out and tested that and we discovered it wasn't true. Now, the way you might have done that was by putting something in front of those customers which didn't work, right? A prototype, which we thought would be interesting to them, and they soundly rejected. So I did some work with the Chamber of Commerce of Dubai, which is one of the largest and most active chambers of commerce in the world. And there was this running hypothesis inside the organization about certain types of organizations in Africa who would want to do business in Dubai. And this hypothesis emerged after a lot of conversations about business model innovation. And we eventually decided we really need to test this because we've been talking about it as if it's, you know, definitively going to happen. And the way we did it was we created sort of a preliminary idea around a service that the chamber could provide. And we blasted that out to all these companies in Northern Africa that the chamber had prior contact with. And it described the nature of the service and the way that it would connect them to the Dubai economy. And lo and behold, when they sent that out, the response rate was very low, way lower than what they expected. They thought the response rate was going to be in the 40% range, and the response rate was actually around 8%. And then when they followed up even with that 8%, it turned out that less than a quarter of those respondents actually wanted the service that the Dubai Chamber had assumed they were interested in. So in the sense that they wanted to go and sell something, that was a huge failure. But we learned something incredibly important, which was we misunderstood the nature of what these types of African companies wanted to do within the Dubai economy. And so that was the part that we wanted to reward. We want to reward the successful outcome of the experiment. So there's one example of how you can approach this process, and a fairly high level one, because it obviously failure is going to look different at every organization and at different parts of the organization. If you have internal IT groups, you have internal processes, you can't reward them and you can't create the structures in the same way.
Well, thanks for that, Adam. I know we're a little beyond our 12:30 here, and there were some other great questions, so maybe we can you know, put some of those together and brainstorm how to get those out. But thank you so much, Adam, for your time, and thank you all for joining us. But before we end, I just wanted to let you know that this innovation topic is further explored. And Adam, do you want to advance your screen a little bit? There you go. Thank you. We have a 2-day program that's launching in September, and Adam will be teaching the core principles of innovation to implement a comprehensive innovation system, as well as processes to facilitate innovation across your organization. So we'd love to see you at that next session, September 19th and 20th. So please keep that in mind. And again, thank you so much for spending, I know how busy you all are, for spending a half hour with us today plus. And thanks for attending. And all I can say is go out and innovate. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.